So this is my talk, Common Mistakes by New Game Developers, version 2.0. And the reason it's 2.0 we'll get to in just a second, but basically I used to have another talk by the same name. This isn't that one. I'm Chris DeLeon. I've worked on 128 released games, over 200 prototypes, and I help run Indiecade. The vast majority of those games fall in the practice category. They are not industrial scale, heavily invested in. A handful of them have been finalists in competitions, had millions of players, earned other companies who aren't me significant sums of money, or been at AAA scale or whatever. But the vast majority of them are completely under the radar. No reason you should have or would have ever heard of them. But as I'll be talking about, part of that is how I've been able to have a few sort of grow well because of the amount of just yield that I'm kind of planting seeds and seeing what grows. You can find me at @GamKeto on Twitter. That used to be at HobbyGameDev, and game devs like you in the middle of that. Or at gamketo.com. There's no E in the middle. It's not Game Keto. It's GamKeto. But that's got more of my stuff if you're curious to look me up after this. So the reason this is Talk 2.0 is that I gave a talk by this exact same title at Indiecade 2015. The full video of that is free at chrisdeleon.com. And so if you're curious to catch that, I'm trying to not do too much overlap. There's a full video of that. You're welcome to watch that. There's some things I think are important. I might pick one or two little threads to kind of re-emphasize here because I think they're important enough that I would be remiss to not call attention to that in a talk about common beginner mistakes to avoid. But for the most part, I'm trying to cover different examples, different kind of stuff, different kind of points. So just put it out there if you want to look up that other talk. Like I say, totally free video of it, recorded from Indiecade last year. So there's a lot of really bad, dangerous advice out there, is one of the things I will start with. And it's important to learn how to navigate that, how to filter for that. And this emerges not because anyone means you harm. People mean well and they want to help. And so when they find that you're struggling with something or have questions about something, they want to help you out. But unfortunately, a lot of them lack the experience too. Or they will, because of that, the best they can do is pass along their own untested advice or stuff they've ever heard. Or the other side effect is that some of this advice becomes very outdated very quickly. Things that were a great idea 3 years ago turn out to be a terrible idea now. This is a very rapidly evolving space. Someone who's had one thing work really well but hasn't had it work in different teams, different contexts, different situations or scales may be confused into thinking that they found the key, the secret, the thing that they need to just tell you. And as soon as you do it, you have the silver bullet. That, of course, rarely works out well for them either. And people will mistake being able to do it, even if they've been doing it for 20, 25 years, with being able to teach it, which is its own separate set of skills to screw up at along the way when getting started and learn how to learn from those mistakes about what's working for people and isn't. And of course, I know these things because 5 or 6 years ago when I started blogging about this stuff, I was making some of these same mistakes in total innocence and total my earnestness to help. And so because a lot I've been doing that time since has been testing these things out, working with people directly, working with people in contexts where we can try out what's relevant still, what's no longer relevant, those kind of things. So one thing I like to emphasize too is that really solid advice requires context. I mean, this is kind of maybe obvious, but in order to really give good advice, I need to know you, I need to know what you want to do, I need to know what you're willing to risk, etc. In spite of that, or without that, at best we can kind of put down some kind of large categories of there's kind of like this path to doing things and that path to doing things, or here's some totally introductory beginning stuff to know. But beyond that, if you're looking for really deep advice, it's going to be really tough to find on just like happens to have asked the right question on Stack Overflow that is the very particular kind of, especially non-technical question you might have questions about. But there's kind of two very different paths that people do to do things in game development professionally. And I think it's increasingly a difference in how you approach learning it and doing it if you have a different goal in mind. These used to be kind of the same pathway in because of the fact that indie games are sort of in a sleeper situation since the late 80s. And so basically, indie developer, studio career, either way, you kind of did the same stuff. It is now differentiated enough that I think it's worth noting that if someone's goals are one side or the other, they may want to emphasize different aspects of their work or how they do it. And so just, most of my slides won't be reading to you, but some of these first ones, I do have some things where I just want to make sure that these get laid out there. In a studio career environment, your credentials will absolutely matter. They'll care about your grades. They'll care about your degrees. This is also a case where I had someone explain that even if the grade isn't something that's not game development related, in a hiring environment where corporate people have to make decisions, they will often look at grades as an indicator of who's willing to do the hard slog work that's not fun, that they're not into, because kind of that makes a good employee. That's someone who will get the stuff done. It involves networking very actively. Most jobs that hit the market, probably I'm semi-making this number up, I'm also borrowing it from career advisors who I have meetings with, will say anywhere from like 85 to 95% of the jobs are never listed publicly. They're never posted to websites. It is instead people asking people to like, hey, I'm looking for a character modeler, who do you know? Or we have an opening for a programmer, who can you trust? And that might sound really kind of nepotistic or unfortunate, just kind of like oh, I'm not a part of the cliques. But it's also just like the very human reality of like we can trust people we trust kind of extend their network to in a way that's often safer to experiment with than a total unknown of just kind of like, I got this piece of paper that seems like they've done stuff. Is just so much extra work to push through. And so it is to say those are filters that are very active, and going to conferences and speaking to strangers is a part of learning to navigate that. It will involve big office politics. This is a part that had completely surprised me in my transition from small indie teams and hobbyist teams to my brief life in big studio life environments or startup environments, where there was just whole extra social experiences to be challenged and overcome. About it wasn't even just about being a good designer or being a good programmer or being a good producer type role. It also had to do with like, how do we function as a team? What are our patterns? How do we operate in meetings? And just a different set of skills that are used that you have to kind of pick up and accept as a part of that kind of work. It is ultimately a desk job. And as I'll talk about later on, like in part, it pays better because it can be so reliable. But it is ultimately in some way, shape, and form. It's fun and it's cool, and you are doing game stuff, and you are usually allowed to have action figures on your desk. But it is not actually super crazy different from like being a programmer on non-games or being a interface designer with Microsoft or IBM or some other type of environment where like that work has to get done. They need certain skills, and talented, creative, cool people go there. But it's a desk job ultimately. You're also, of course, less likely to have much control or as much control. And this is one of the side effects that also happens from, especially say early on in life, some of the stuff that always speaks to us when we're younger is very high profile, big brand stuff. And this is inherent to the power of branding, to the power of distribution networks, especially pre-modern, YouTube, Let's Players, etc., helping to spread the word for smaller stuff. But like a lot of us have our targets initially set on the Blizzards, on the Activisions, on the EAs, on the Ubisofts, etc. And they make amazing games. There are super talented people there. But it is to say that if you insert yourself into edition 4 or 5 of a franchise with hundreds of talented, capable, also smart, experienced people working on it, no given person has a lot of pull over where that aircraft carrier goes. There are lots of other factors and processes at play, and so it depends on what you want to be a part of and what you're after, but that is one of the other trade-offs that goes into that kind of thing. Certainly pays more reliably. Later on, I'll talk to some actual specifics of that. Now, the other thing that has taken maybe me more years in hindsight to recognize is that it's not quite as stable either than some other kind of lines of work, of course. Like, these are things that as broad, sweeping movements, when I was leaving my semi-more stable career path in industry to look at doing indie stuff, I was like, well, there's like the safe bet of I could hang around here and keep making games, getting paid to like worry about my specialization, or I could go try to strike out in the Wild West and make some mistakes in a different sphere. And shortly after I left, the entire franchise I was on ended. Shortly after that franchise ended, another franchise in the branch ended. And what happens is that in these kind of environments, massive shifts happen every few years in terms of how games get paid for, in terms of what platforms are popular, in terms of what techniques or technologies are needed. And as a consequence, not because any given person did anything wrong, not because you were or weren't even delivering, but it's like, okay, well, this entire franchise we lost a license to. Or it's like, well, we're not going to renew our contract on blank. Or, well, for some sort of internal political reason, we're not going to work on console X, Y, or Z, so this whole thing kind of just disappears. And just these massive sweeps that are so much bigger than the people can sweep up lots of people. And these are the kind of downsizes that we read online about 1,000 people here, 500 people here. Those add up. And as we'll talk about, some of those people actually wind up using indie development as a life raft, not intentionally, of, okay, I've got these skills, I've got these coworkers, what do I do? Maybe we try this for a little bit. Now the upside too of this, and I don't mean to poo-poo it, it is an awesome path in life some people are super happy with, is it does enable a vastly different level of deep specialization and focus on doing one thing very well. One of the examples I love to point to for this is that, and this is a slight exaggeration, but not a total exaggeration, is we basically had somebody who was like the hand animator. And if somebody wanted to animate hands, well, you don't get to because he's doing it. And if he wants to do something else that day, sorry, they need him animating hands. And it's this kind of fine example of like how deep on a giant team specialization, or especially in the studio of multiple games, can get, where there can be someone who's like the particle effects person, the lighting person, which if you're deeply interested in a very particular slice of it, and what you like is the idea that you go to work, someone tells you, make this part of the game work, or figure out the design challenges around making this kind of level work, and you can go home at the end of the day and not worry about, was that the right thing to be doing? Was that the right task? There's some upsides to that, and that's more the studio kind of career path. Now, the indie stuff, of course, as you might have already read ahead, is riskier, like a lot riskier, seriously, though. Super risky. Like when there's people who get into STEM paths of education, where they're learning computer science, computer programming, and they're partly thinking about like, aha, I'm not like those guys who are taking creative writing classes, or those girls who I know in these other sort of like softer fields. The indie developer route is frankly a softer field as far as careers go. It is much more like trying to make it as an independent artist, athlete, comedian, or writer, in that there are so many talented, capable, earnest people who are hungry to succeed at it, and you are up against them. And it's not to say it can't be done. There are people who are doing it. It is to say that it is much different from the space of, I just have to impress the right HR person to get my foot in the door to get a job someplace that'll pay me. As part of that, there is a massive fight for visibility, as I think people are too aware of. We'll talk some more about numbers of that in the future, too. Expecting to balance contract work. And this is a piece that I think is super essential for early beginners to recognize about the indie developer path. Most indie developers that they see interviews from, that they see giving speeches on stages, that they see games winning IGF, etc., for some non-trivial chunk of time, maybe years, maybe still, maybe after the game came out, they're also doing contract work. And contract work, for people who are less familiar with it, because it's inherently not as cool of a topic to talk about, is like a yogurt company needs an advertising game made for their website. Or it's like one of my first contracts was a solar panel game to help advertise this coupon deal in California. And it's not this super amazing, like, when I grow up, I want to make solar panel advertising games kind of thing. It's just like, there's companies that have an existing infrastructure, they have money flowing in and out, they have marketing expense, they want to look hip, cool, and trendy and be able to have a game, and they don't want to hire an expensive studio to do it, so they're more likely to hand that contract out to someone small and nimble who's like not 100% relying on that, but partly. The other nice thing about contract work in this kind of case is that it's very scalable. Notwithstanding the terror of where does money come from when this contract ends in 2 to 3 months, if you ever need more money, you can theoretically tack on another 2 or 3 contracts and juggle in tandem, since unlike a full-time job, they have no say over what you do with the rest of your time. If or when your game that you're working on, as part of what you're enabling yourself to do with the contract work, needs some more time given to it, you can kind of try to ratchet down how many contracts you're working on at a time and go back to like, okay, I just need to get this thing shipped, or I have some sort of deadline for an external press conference or whatever. The other part of this is that converse to the deep specialization of a studio career is that you have to learn to wear many hats. And not necessarily all the hats. A lot of the strongest indie stuff we have on the market is multiple people. But it is to say, at the very least, you or someone on your team will have to understand and deal with how the sausage is made in terms of business. And these are things that inherently, for a million reasons, make a lot of really smart, technical, creative people, which is most people involved in game development, really uncomfortable with all the things involved with marketing, where it can feel slimy, it can feel icky, it can feel gross. Likewise for contract negotiation, for dealing with large amounts of money going in and out. But they're a part of how that, like I say, sausage gets made. And if you want to avoid looking at that directly, you could bury yourself in a studio where some other department takes care of that for you. The same thing's happening at a bigger, kind of grosser scale, but it's just part of how this stuff has to happen. And the last thing about indie developer is, again, kind of in the case of on a bigger studio, we can count on there's some other department worrying about that, is you absolutely, I think it's essential to find some kind of legal or tax help. And I say these, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't actually like say who to look to or whatever. But I will say that those are things that are easy to mess up, they are expensive to get wrong, and they can be the difference between whether or not you're staying in business or like going into debt over screwing something up that with a little bit of like, yeah, it's expensive for like a 3-hour kind of appointment, but can help you clear up something that might make you a big difference down the line. Now, I'll also mark that I have the asterisks up there for like how to do it professionally. Game development makes an amazing hobby. I'm super in love with the idea of people making games, even if it's not their career. I don't care what their day job is. Everyone should be making games as far as I'm concerned. But I also figure that's probably not why you're here at this particular talk. So I'm not going to emphasize too much about that kind of story. But yeah, I wrote hobby game dev articles like every week for 6 years. So I super love the idea of a hobby, but that's not our focus today. Now, out of even the category of indie, we can further subdivide that into, now the word kind of gets thrown around a lot to mean a lot of different things. They'll say like, oh, I'm an indie game dev, hashtag indie dev on Twitter. There's sort of 3 different columns we might chunk this into. And broadly, they might fall in the category of practice, personal, or commercial kind of aimed stuff. And these distinctions being that practice projects, it's anywhere from following tutorials to making a pretty straightforward remake. And for lots of people, the path I tend to encourage is that if you're newer to a technology platform, if you're new to making games at all, is to start off with something kind of 70s era complexity, back in your kind of breakout and Pong historical era, moving your way up into sort of tile-based graphics. And a lot of it, people actually stop around the time they reach mid-90s, and or they switch over to Unity for 3D stuff. But it's a case where practice projects, the point isn't really to make that game, or the point isn't really, you're certainly not trying to put that up for sale. Some people don't even release these things on the internet. I think it's useful to, but you don't have to. But it's really built around, there's certain skills I need practice at, and I know that the first time I'm doing it in a commercial project should not be the first time that I'm doing it at all. I should have already tried to write some kind of pathfinding if I need that for a commercial project. I should have written already some sort of tile collision if I need that in a commercial project, etc. And these are how we work those things out of our system. They think of them as stepping stones. Part of what I do as a trainer is we figure out what someone's goal project they want to work on, and we figure out, okay, well, how can we break out the pieces of that and build them kind of a roadmap from where they're at to where they want to be, So by the time they get there, it's second, third draft of any given piece that's important to it. For personal or loosely, most jams fall in this category too. These are the things that we tend to have more kind of dreams about. It's like, it's your vision, it's stuff you want to do, it's the game you want to play. Now the challenge, as I've marked here, is that it's totally saturated. And this is a side effect of the fact that many of us have comparable influences if we're into game development. And not to overgeneralize people, but there's a certain category of culture and humanity that has found itself growing up with video games, and the kind of games that we want to play, not coincidentally, are a reflection of that. And so because of that, some games thrive in this space, but they tend to be a very, very tiny fragment or narrow sliver, and it's really, really got to stand out on polish. It's really got to be special if it's the same kind of game that lots of other indies are kind of categorically making. This tends to ignore biz dev. For better or for worse. This tends to just kind of ignore the fact that business is a thing. Some people will drain their savings doing this stuff. Some people just kind of keep their day job, and this is just sort of their passion project. They moonlight on the weekends or whatever. A lot of people's attitude towards it is like, if it makes money, cool, and if it doesn't, whatever. And that's an approach as long as they're going into it with that expectation of they're not counting on their savings getting recouped, or they're not counting on this to be the boat they're going to float on. It's usually, it's an approach. And the third category, of course, is the much more commercial. These are straight up for paying customers. This is where we have people working on games they might not even themselves play. Sometimes these might be games for children. This might be games done for a contractor for an outside agency. These have to be maintained. So one of the differences between a passion project or a commercial project is this expectation that, like, it's going to work on all the different kinds of devices. It's going to keep working after the next iOS change happens. It's going to keep working after some other changes go through. In a way that, like, so I had some passion projects I made for iPhone stuff or personal projects, and, like, they changed how OpenGL worked on the iPhone, and I just didn't care when it stopped working on certain devices, because I was like, it's a free game, get over it, I don't care. Games that I was paid for, or someone was paid for, it was on somebody's problem and plate to figure out, well, we got to go back and fix all this stuff, and actually make a calculation of, like, is this worth it on my time, or paying someone else to keep it maintained? If you have any sort of game with a live internet backend for multiplayer, for scorekeeping, whatever, sometimes security stuff comes along and you've got to update a bunch of stuff. These are almost always non-trivial and the money needed to stand a chance. And that may not necessarily be in the form of paying contractors to help with art, audio, animation, sound, cutting video trailers, etc. It may also be, but it also takes the form of, if you're doing something commercially, you probably need to be flying yourself to conferences, networking with other people who also know the kind of things that you need to know, getting to figure out, learn a bit from their mistakes, which always, like I say, work out personally if they know your situation, which involves much easier sitting around a table than trying to just sort of send them an email like, hey, I'm a stranger, what's up? As of 2015, and this is not a super awesome fact, but it is, I think, a reality we've been facing. For my podcast, I talk to people once every week or two, and a lot of the indie teams that, at least as of, say, last year even, that we see commercially succeeding are overwhelmingly no longer solo developers. They're often a team of anywhere from 3 to 12, and they're often ex-studio. They're often people who, like I say, got displaced through layoffs or quit together. And they're going into it with, they have professional skill sets. They know the engine very well. They're used to the idea of this being a 40-hour-a-week effort. And they're going into it with a completely different level of momentum than someone who's pre-studio. Because one of the mentalities used to be like, oh, I'll make indie games to get AAA studio's attention. And one of the weird things that's happened, I think, in that space is that if you're really into the idea of, like, I have my own ideas and I like to realize those and I like to do everything myself, an HR person may actually look at that like, oh, that might be kind of like a handful to try to manage that person. Or, you know, we really need someone to work on someone else's idea. And that's where they'd actually kind of rather see maybe even some contract work where you were kind of subservient to, there's an outside design spec, I have a customer I'm here to satisfy, and being able to think the idea of switching that to an internal producer as opposed to an external contract agency. And in terms of tables to compare this kind of stuff, how does it tend to start out? If it's a practice project, you're usually either following steps, or like I say, if you're doing a practice remake or a practice clone, which is super different from cloning to try to knock someone off in the commercial sphere, then you're frankly following steps. You're looking at what is there to do, what have I not done a score yet, is there not explosions yet, whatever. In a personal project, you're prototyping very cheaply, very inexpensively. And in a commercial case, you almost always need some sort of proof of traction. And so this is, as we'll talk about, often comes from how a personal or practice project winds up being received unexpectedly. But in order to really kind of shove that kind of energy, effort, and time into it, I think it's often wisest if you can make sure, has it got some sort of recognition? Are people talking about it? Is the YouTube video getting shared? Does it have non-trivial traffic numbers online as a free demo, as a free proof of concept or whatever? And that can help justify, aha, I can do this, which besides your own sanity of like, am I just shoveling money into a black hole, also has the upside of helping to prove to investors or to press that this is a thing that people will care about when it's done, since it's not yet in your fancier version. As a reasonable expense for practice, I would super encourage Zero. There are ample free/super cheap tutorial stuff on the internet, or even, like I say, grab any Atari NES era game, look at it, piece out how to make that one-screen game kind of rework in your platform of choice. For personal, pretty minimal. This tends to take the form of if you're releasing it commercially at all, you may or may not want to talk to a lawyer or financial assistant person about some of the cost, what you can deduct from your taxes, about licensing fees for different platforms, about sometimes as simple as stuff as, like I say, maybe going to a conference or two to even kind of reinvest in your personal stuff. But commercial projects, like I say, non-trivial investment, there's usually some amount of savings or outside investment getting thrown into that. Risk for practice, 0. Minimal for personal, and commercial is significant. It's one of the other distinguishers we can look at as to what category does a kind of project fit into, and thus what kind of advice might be applicable. Now, one thing that I think is important to consider, especially for those of us who are going into it especially with our personal projects in mind, is that it's totally okay for design to consider the means of profitability. For arcade games, there were certain kinds of games that got made based on the sort of quarters system where you would die very quickly because it'll make it more quarters. And a lot of us grew up with that aesthetic in my age group, and we were fine with it because that's what we grew up with. Not too long after that, people got into console games where the experiences tend to be much longer, in part because you wouldn't just rent that game in a weekend, have the full experience, and move on. You needed more time to soak up all that story, and so you got a different kind of game designed around that financial constraint. Now, there are some newer means that games get paid for, whether it's Kickstarter crowdfunding, whether it's in-app purchasing stuff, whether it's ad-supported, whatever, and consequently different kinds of games that either have to do with they try to keep you coming back, or they try to keep you your attention for longer sessions or for shorter sessions or whatever. I think if you're trying to run an actual business, it's entirely appropriate to look at that as a constraint of how can I do that and still do the thing I'm trying to do. And that if you totally ignore that, it's a bit like making an arcade-era style game and dumping it out there, which is to say, there's an audience of people who love that aesthetic, and it's not a profitable thing anymore. It's just not how business works and what people can pay for. And so ultimately looking at the intersection of what you feel like making, what others like to play, and the only way to tell that is to test it with strangers, and also what fits into today's channels or ways of people to pay, which also, like I say in the case of contracting stuff, might be indirect. If someone else, say in VR space right now, there's lots of investor money getting thrown around, where somebody just wants to have their thing realized in VR. Maybe it's an architecture firm or whatever, and you can find a way to fuel that and funnel that into, okay, well, how can I find an overlap there and what I'm trying to do or practice or learn that people want? One of the other mistakes people will make when they are totally new is they will overplan. And often when I ask veteran game developers what advice they have for newer developers, they're like, oh, I wish I would have planned more. And I think this is one of the signs of they haven't tried teaching yet. Because when you try to walk someone through planning, if they're totally new, is they lack the experience to really plan productively. Like they haven't run into the problems to know what to mitigate against, or they haven't really tried the stuff to figure out how long certain things take. So as a beginning game developer, I would encourage to not worry too much about ultra-specific plans. The other downside of a really specific plan, say in the form of like a thick game design document, is you can wind up really tied to it, really kind of married to it, and feeling like, well, this is what it is, and if I wanted to change my plan, I got to change this. Agility is your strength. It is your advantage. A bigger company has to plan. A bigger company has to stick to that plan because they have certain dates and expectations and other kinds of deadlines tied to it. Ultimately, as an independent developer, you're trying to make things that they can't make. You're trying to make things that are not worth it, not on their radar. And occasionally what that means is that if we use the kind of example of like a Disneyland theme park, those are architected in a way, right, where there's like Magic Kingdom's way over there or Epcot Center's way over there. And people go that direction because it looks like there's a way worth going, but halfway there, they discover something else worth doing. And while that might seem like a distraction or seem like a pivot, as indie developers, often we start with a plan. On our process there, we might discover something else cool worth exploring, and you got to make sort of an informed trade-off between like, okay, is that my next project, or is that what this one becomes? And there's no right or wrong because it depends on the project, but it's just something to look at as to like, again, agility is your advantage, and to take full advantage of that. Now, I will say, and I feel kind of bad saying this, if any of y'all do this or involved in this, my own professional opinion is that asset stores and using found assets tends to be for suckers, or tends to not be a way that real games get made. I think that overwhelmingly what winds up happening is, it's like I find this handful of pieces, and I've seen this in people I've worked with, where then they feel constrained to design their game around the stuff that they happen to be able to find, which is the same thing that 10,000 other people also happen to find. And you wind up with these very generic, very, very piecemeal, very cookie cutter kind of things that aren't the kind of thing that differentiate what you're doing, that aren't a unique hook. And if we look at any number of successful indie games, anything from Cube to Minecraft to Hazard, etc., they tend to... Antichamber, not Hazard. They tend to pick a very, very low fidelity, kind of crummy or ugly aesthetic, but really stick to it across the board. It's better to have lots of non-pretty stuff match than to have like one incredibly high fidelity, well-animated, professionally made dragon, and the rest is just kind of like doesn't fit that. So what I encourage people to do instead is to at least be comfortable enough with your content tools, Photoshop, Blender, GIMP, whatever it is you use, to mash out recognizable functional placeholder stuff instead of leaning on asset store or found assets. So the goal isn't to make a stylized or a pretty helicopter or an artistically pleasing one. It is like, can I tell that that's a helicopter? And if so, then okay, then we can test the mechanics with an audience. We can have strangers play it. And if they really seem hyped about it, that might then justify for me finding an actual artist to either contract out or partner with to then replace some of the shoddy placeholder art that until then most games aren't actually worth investing at the next level at when you start testing them with people. So yeah, make ugly games is one of the things I like to preach to investigate what's worth making less ugly. Does anybody know what this is?
I'm guessing early Minecraft.
That is Splatoon. That's right, I heard a second person say it. That was the first prototype of Splatoon. Yeah, now on the flip side, Minecraft didn't actually ever change this much from this, right? I mean, bumpa. Right. But anyway, but it is to say that even at commercial industrial level, they first proved out the gameplay on the really crummy fast to iterate form, because the other thing that tends to happen is, it's just like when you're revising a paper, right? You don't start editing minor grammar mistakes and spelling and stuff until pretty late in the process, because your earlier revisions are ripping out entire paragraphs and entire pages and rearranging whole chunks and adding a new chapter. And so when you're doing that, you want your game looking and feeling like this at first, when it's cheaper to do that, before you've sunk a lot of energy into, we can't pull that feature out because we already burned 2 months on it. And it's just a different kind of problem to be in, and this is also why we don't invest in our art too early until we've decided it's something worth investing in. One of the things that I'm trying to take as a new filter on this kind of like accepting that there is a business reality and a context in which certain kinds of games can be funded or fueled or keep a business going is that playing design, just like car design or most other kind of physical design, it's a creative task, it's a design task, but it still has to fly in the air. And if your effort and your goal is to make games professionally, there are certain types of games that can be made professionally that are more likely to fly in the air than others. And so we start to kind of think in terms of like, what are the aerodynamics of that? And I will now continue to overextend this wacky metaphor for at least another couple of slides. The first of which is that it's okay to leverage conventions. It's okay to use outside knowledge. I think there's a tendency to not want to steal or not feel like we're copying. And so we want to have our own way of doing the health system. We want to have our own way of doing scoring, our own way of doing combat, our own way of doing movement and input and everything else, and a completely innovative approach to menus. And the problem is, it's like an experiment where you change every variable. You can't figure out what's working or isn't. And so the approach I tend to encourage instead is to limit experimentation to 1 to 3 key innovations or concepts per game. So like in the case of this X-29 and obviously experimental aircraft, it's pretty obvious there's kind of exactly 1, maybe 2, kind of big concepts they're really experimenting with. Besides that, though, they weren't trying to like fundamentally redesign every other thing about what makes an airplane work and how its engine works and how the materials are made and so on. It allowed them to focus on like, okay, what are our key innovations here and how do we do those well to really test those answers and get that information out of it. The other bit is that while you're figuring out what can stay in the air, if you picture kind of early Wright brothers era, you want to avoid risking too much in the likely wreck. Most of these planes did not take off, most of them did not stay in the air for long, and most of them when they landed could not be used again. And so consequently, they spent less on the materials, they spent less time on putting together. Besides, can we just answer the question, is this a thing that would be safe to spend more energy and time on mass producing or doing more thoroughly or doing better? And likewise, picturing this when you're working on your games of how do we keep the lightweight thing that answers our questions of if it's worth sinking more energy, time, and investment and attention into this. So I like to encourage ongoing lean or zero-cost game development as a fundamentally exploratory activity where you're building to answer questions that you have and test your ideas. This frees you up to take creative risks in a way that you can't if you're only working on things that you feel confident about. This allows you to take chances that the bigger studios and companies can't afford to put any cycles or time on. This also gets you practice with finishing steps before it counts, because like I've mentioned, by the time something matters on a commercial project, you don't have to be your first time doing it. That also applies to distributing an executable or testing on other platforms, either of which tends to have little quirks or challenges that you might not have anticipated if you felt like you were most of the way done on a game. This is also, of course, a good way to get external validation to justify if it makes sense to do a bigger project for a sequel or a follow-up to the initial practice or exploratory thing that you worked on. Revision by proxy is an example that we worked on in 3 different stages. When this project was started, it was a student class project. They had the same month-long time frame as everybody else or whatever, and 4 people put together a game that then got a chance to, it got in to show their game at Indiecade at E3's booth, which that was actually as far as that went. That didn't win any other awards, it wasn't a finalist, but that was then enough attention for them to wave around, get some new team members added to help redo the art, and to totally redo the engine, and to give it a whole second pass of like, okay, people like this concept, but something about this wasn't working yet. So we did 2nd edition. That got 7 million plays worldwide, about half in China, about half in English-speaking countries. And then from that, we were then made a sequel, Miss Vision by Proxy, during which time we were then able to have meetings with outside people who wanted to either fund the game, license the game, get it ported to a platform at their own expense for some cut of the earnings, etc., because we had traffic numbers to prove, because it had been through a few different layers of iteration. but any one of which might not have been prudent to have tried to skip a step, since at the same time it was also making lots of other games that did not reach this step of its development. And the only way to know if something's going to work is to try it and see if it wrecks or flies. You've got to practice releasing and finishing your stuff. There is an exception to this, and that is if you're in a domain that is heavily saturated in the market space. There's lots of like war FPS games. Those games can be planned ahead of time with some confidence of like this'll go somewhere. And if you're in that space, so you're literally competing against competitors with $250 million, 180 people in 4 years to do their games. And you might want to look for a space where you've got to kind of go off and do your experimental thing, like I say, to do stuff that is currently outside their radar, outside their vision. And the other talk that's from IndieK 2015 you'll hear on the website, talk about as red ocean versus blue ocean is a marketing term we use for those, just meaning as to like, is this a saturated space or is this an exploratory, others haven't quite found this fishing hole yet kind of thing. Another tip for beginners is that my experience, at least with people I've trained, tends to be that knowing how to work without Unity will improve how you use Unity. And I think this also applies to other engines like Unreal. And it's a bit like if you could grab a graphing calculator doesn't mean that you should skip all math prior to algebra. I think it's useful to know how to do some things by hand. And then likewise in Unity, if you have never had to write a game in which you've got to write your own movement code, your own collision code, your own input code, even if it's not super fancy stuff, it becomes harder and you start to get blind spots in Unity of what it's doing for you and that there's ways to override those to make your game look or feel different from the other games that are kind of built from the surface layer of what Unity makes it easier and natural for us to do. So there are 7 new Steam games per day. This is from 2015, and 750 new mobile games per day. Now, that sounds like not a lot of Steam games by comparison, but if you think in terms of the number of Steam games you've paid attention to, I don't know about all of y'all, it often actually winds up being kind of like a handful per year, right? Which is to say that there's, again, lots and lots of competition going on. There's lots of other games getting made, and that's the kind of space that you're wading into if you're going at the commercial angle, which can be done, but that is what you're up against. This is also part of why mobile people especially feel that pain of the discovery challenge of there is kind of 1 or 2 storefronts for where people find that stuff, and it is an absolute tidal wave that they're up against trying to dethrone the Angry Birds and the few other kind of higher-ups that keep those slots. This is a number, this is from 2013, so this is already 2-3 years out of date, of the amount earned on average by indie developers in 2013, which, depending on where you live in the country, this is probably not someone's primary source of income, or shouldn't be. This is like half of what I made yearly, like as a graduate student doing research. And that was down 49% from the year before, which is to say that as competition has risen, that number may have gotten worse depending on who's willing to take those surveys. But it is to be a warning of like, maybe not all the eggs in one basket on that. The similar sort of reading from the same source was that 57% of indie developers, of course, most of them, this is both team and solo, by the way, earned under $500 in sales. So that number, that average was actually pretty skewed by that. That's, of course, not even enough to recoup like getting an LLC formed or one meeting with a lawyer, etc. Now, 2% of them did earn over $200,000, and in some cases pretty non-trivially. Those are often the interviews that we tend to see or hear, on media, in movies, in documentaries, prominently on sites or in sort of conference speaking and so on. And those people can then reinvest that money into their next project and hope that they kind of hit the ball at the park again. But just to say that is the kind of numbers that we tend to be looking at in that space. And usually with those people, right, it's not their first time they've done this. They usually have had a few sort of hops and skips along the way, trying to kind of get that to click in the right place and time. By contrast, 60 to 80K is much more kind of the typical average early career studio salary, depending again on the size of the studio and what kind of role you're taking, what expertise or credentials you're bringing into it. Now, the other upside of studios, besides the fact that, of course, they're more stable pay, is that they're also very good for making connections. Part of the downside of the industry is it's remarkably high turnover, but the upside of that means that if you spend a year, 2 years at a studio, within 5 years, you actually have friends all over the place because they all wound up other places too. And while you're there, other people funneled in from elsewhere. And so there's also wind up being that even if it's something you strategically kind of plan for in your career of like, okay, I'm going to start with trying to get a career studio job, which is some set of challenges, there are other benefits there in terms of making those kind of connections. Like I mentioned from those numbers, the iPhone is unfortunately, I think, an overly popular first target for people to pick. I think it's an extremely tough project platform to first choose. It's fragmented more than it used to be. It's very hard to get visibility. And there's basically an outdated perception like, well, I just have to make the game, Apple will sell it or get in front of the right people. Apple won't help. Those numbers have turned around very rapidly, probably in the first year or two of the platform. It is now much more kind of back on you, except the difference being it's harder to get some of those things to get traction versus where I tend to encourage lots of beginner projects is web games. And I realize web games are not what everyone's super passionate about. They seem simple by comparison sometimes to console or downloadable PC games. They are inherently cross-platform, no installation or download barrier. Far fewer security concerns in that they're reasonably sandboxed within a browser's limitations. No complex configure hardware requirements, and what this results in is that it is often much less battle to get anyone to just test it and give you some feedback. That it's much easier to send someone a link to something they can open in their browser, try it, give you a review, give you feedback, discuss it, share it with their friends, or pass a link on somebody else, than it is if they have to install, download something, which any more modern operating systems, unfortunately, are kind of like child-proofed in a way that they can't even run programs unless they're comfortable enough going to the advanced settings in their browser and then their operating system, and both being like, yeah, trust me to know what I'm doing. This isn't a security threat. And that has added an extra layer of difficulty of getting non-web games out on a more broad platform. And so even though they're tougher performance limits, the other upside to that is it can also help avoid you getting overly lost in really deep optimization details, which, like I say, is if you're going a career studio track, maybe of interest to you, might be worth doing for a later iteration of a project. But early on, I think I've often seen do more harm than good when someone gets lost in a really, really fine detail, as opposed to kind of keeping the bigger picture. Now, oftentimes, too, those same platforms used for web development, fortunately, modern smartphones tend to be pretty friendly with. I tend to teach HTML5 JavaScript as sort of a platform choice for that stuff. Obviously, Unity can also deploy to phones. Unity has, due to various API changes, lost its ability to do the web deployables as well. It can do some WebGL stuff with a different set of constraints, but it is to say that these same kinds of things that you do for a web game can often also extend to at least being able to prototype or playtest stuff on a smartphone, which you then may want to reinvest more energy into doing a different way for commercial deployment if you are so inclined. This is a still, for whatever reason, really stuck in my mind from like a History Channel show randomly that I caught like 4 seconds of years ago. But it's this guy swinging a battle axe, and I don't know anything about fighting with a battle axe. But what the message that the master of the battle axe tends to suggest is you have to keep it swinging because of the effort involved or the weight involved. You don't just want to like wait until you have to strike and then draw it back or you're already dead. It has to keep that momentum up, and then when you can have an opportunity to strike something, you've already got some movement to redirect. And so I often think of that too in terms of making games, where part of why I've produced and worked on so many games is because at any given time, I am working on games. It doesn't mean I had a great idea for a game. It doesn't mean that I am working on my dream game. It means that, I'm not working on a game right now. I need to fill that hole. So I'm always working on games. And what this results in is that anytime there's an opportunity that comes up in life to speak at an event, to help out a team, to whatever, I have some contemporary modern example to draw from, or I have something new to show, or I have something recent to talk about, as opposed to just that thing that one time that I did and it's been a while since I'm getting kind of rusty. A lot of people I've seen phase in and out of this stuff in the 19 years I've been doing it, took a break and kind of never got that momentum back up. It's a little bit like working out, where it's much easier to kind of keep the momentum going than it is to kind of start and stop it on a sort of a heavy kind of just transitional cost. This is just sort of more of a broad tip, maybe more of a life tip than a game dev tip, but I suggest staying out of online arguments. It's kind of a suck of time for everybody, never really that productive, especially for like AAA or III game design stuff. It's like so far from relevant to what we have in our means, but it's very tempting because we're the kind of people who we care about these things, and that's why we're doing in a lot of cases. But generally speaking, it's not a good way to change their mind. You won't change your mind either. My suggestion is to argue about good game design by making better games. That if we look at some of the best indie games that have been made, those have inflected the kind of arguments people are having in a far better way than anything anybody could have said. Oftentimes there are panels of different kind of designers on the stage, and they'll ask them, like, what is good game design to you? And they have vastly different answers that, not surprisingly, line up with the kind of games that they're making. And I think that is because that's how we argue about game design, is we put our ideas about it into practice, and there's many different possible good answers. There's a lot of apples and oranges, and I think the time spent arguing about it is ultimately kind of burned. As just some quick credits, this is a slide template that I've borrowed from the internet, and so likewise with one of the photos. But thanks, y'all. Keep making games, and I'm up for talking about questions and stuff. I want to hear what y'all are thinking about.
First of all, thanks for having us on. My question is, I saw the one slide you said the more stuff you do without Unity, the better it'll make you in Unity. So what do you suggest people start doing? Do you suggest that people start building straight from scratch, or?
So where I tend to, so there's definitely different people agree about different answers about this. Where I tend to send people is, I've made a video course that encapsulates this. It's free, so I'm not trying to sell anybody on it. But like codeyourfirstgame.com is like a 2-hour or 3-hour intro of just using JavaScript HTML5 canvas. That it doesn't use outside libraries. It doesn't lean on outside APIs besides the built-in canvasy stuff. And because there's certain layers of abstraction that, like, on the one hand, I think it's too much if you're using something that's already trying to handle sprite animation for you. It's too much if you're leaning on something that's already doing collisions or movement for you, as most game libraries and frameworks do. On the flip side, I do kind of think that in 2015, it's not as important as it used to be to really get deeply acquainted with, like, C level, C++ level memory allocation and direct interactions with the graphics cards. Unless you're going deeply entrenched specialist towards AAA route, For the indie level, I think a lot of times those concepts increasingly become just like they're like what assembly language was 20 years ago, where it's good to know for debugging purposes and it's good to know for technical reasons, but I think it's not as necessary as it used to be to get that deep into it at the pre-Unity kind of stuff.
All right, thank you. Yeah.
Being a young woman going to go into game design, what have you like? I don't know if this might be personal or not, but what have you seen like happen with other women in the industry? Like just to get an idea of what I'm walking into.
Sure. Man, I have certainly have thoughts, and I will do my best to put them into words. But I always feel like these are things where it's kind of like it's a minefield for me, partly because I don't want anything to be misunderstood or whatever. I had the chance on the podcast to talk to people who like worked on the Atari Jaguar ports or Game Boy Advance games or whatever, and they would talk about how like at that time it was so male dominated, in part because they were people who grew up playing the kind of games that were made by people who happened to have electrical engineering degrees in like the 60s and 70s and 80s, which at that time was predominantly men who could work with that kind of hardware and stuff. And that as those things have changed, I think it's slowly catching up to us and it's slowly changing. And part of the dynamic that I've seen too is that there will be a studio or environment where there's one or two women working. And then I want to clear too that it's not like it's all guys inside the company. There are women who are in the art team, who are in the marketing team, who are in the production team, who are project leads, who are like managing people, project manager, etc. Where it tends to be especially lacking like gameplay coding or occasionally game designer kind of roles, at least historically. And like I say, we're getting better. But it'll be like one woman in that department, and then she feels this like difficulty, I think understandably, of like, do I belong here? I'm fighting constantly against like, I feel like it's me versus their background, their cultural experience, they're coming from, whatever. And what the unfortunate difficulty like is as soon as they feel like they're too uncomfortable and they kind of back out and they're like, all right, you know what, I got to pick my battles in life. I'm going to find a different line of work. I'm done here. Then the next woman who joins the team has that exact same challenge of like, doesn't have at least one other person to help push towards that threshold of being a little more balanced. And that is no one person's role or responsibility to fix, but that's just part of what I've seen too of like a complicating dynamic that has made it a little stickier than I think ought to have been in terms of how much progress is made in some other areas of the industry. But I mean, awesome. Good luck. Like I say, it's a challenge that has unfortunately some other things. So now I'll also say, so the upside to that is that there are, because of that, have been great outreach efforts from IGDA, from Intel, certainly from Indiecade, which I help organize, to help try to connect women in game development to other peers and mentors and other people who have kind of fought some of those battles and can speak to it much better than I can from my limited, narrow window of having never been on that side of those discussions. So that might also be a thing to look into as to like what opportunities are there unique to getting in touch with mentors who have fought those kind of battles and can answer those questions better than I can.
Great.
But,
thank you very much.
Sure.
I'm already feeling like I'll walk into a game design class and it's like, I see two other girls here. There were women at Becker, right?
Yeah, and again, I'll say like the problem is not unique to Becker for what it's worth. It's a challenge we're all trying to figure out how to improve.
Yeah, thank you.
Just a quick question. For someone looking to go into a studio-focused career, what do you think about areas in QA and testing? Do you think that's a good place to start, or is that a bit too typical?
There are people who make it work. There are people who've taken that path. I think that overwhelmingly it is no longer a reliable way in. I think that in the Sega console era, that was certainly a time when QA was the path into game design. Now, remember too, in that area, there were scarcely any colleges that focused on the stuff. Now it is increasingly difficult to get, I think, past that wall. And a lot of studios will actually have separated like a whole different floor, whole different division, different security paths, whatever, to get across that gap. And I don't think I've seen a lot of people churn in and out of QA without making a more stable career out of it or feeling kind of stuck in that path or that kind of line. Now, that said, too, like QA is respectable work. There are more advanced positions that can be worked up within QA. There are QA management level stuff, director level stuff, people who are then direct liaisons or installed on the team, whatever. But I think it's been more rare, and especially anymore now, there are increasingly people coming out of school with expertise in this stuff and outside projects to administrate, to get hired into those roles when that's who they're competing against. And so that's obviously, if you can get your foot in the door, make some connections, it doesn't hurt maybe to try it, find out for yourself. It might be different for every single company and opportunity. Everyone's path is different. But I certainly wouldn't, at the very least, if you were doing that, I would encourage that as your day job while you're moonlighting, making games, teaching yourself more skills, forming other teams, making other connections, and not relying on that I can just work here in this role and it'll, evolve into something on the team.
Again, I would like to thank you for that speech you gave. I thought it was incredibly insightful and informative. Now, going back to the topic of studio careers, you mentioned that for indies, their salary has essentially been halved over the period of 12 months. And so I was wondering, how hard is it, for studio careers, how hard is it to break into the game industry nowadays compared to what it's been like in previous years?
One thing I will say is that it definitely depends on what kind of company or job you're after. There are jobs that are in higher demand and more people are knocking on their doors and asking for them to look at their stuff. And those kind of places too can obviously take a much thinner shave of the cream off the top as to we're not even going to look at the resume until they have X years, or we're not even going to look at this until they whatever situation. That said, so a lot of the opportunities I think are actually maybe hidden at a lot of the mid-level studios, a lot of the service studios. Now, some mid-level studios who made their own IP have kind of vanished as the AAA has gotten more tightly squeezed. But I guess what I mean is service studios where sometimes a big company, the EA, Activision, etc., will hire some outside mid-level, mid-sized studio to kind of ghost write or develop okay, we're going to work on single player, make our multiplayer out of these assets, or we're going to make the main game, you release our DLC expansion pack or whatever. And it's a chance to simultaneously get AAA kind of interaction with the engine, with the experience, with the decisions made by that team creatively, etc. But there are probably fewer resumes flying at them in terms of hey, I'm prepared adequately, I have proper formal training in this in addition to my own projects, give me a shot. They're probably easier to get the ear of than some of the direct bigger companies. It might also be a good springboard into it because then you're hey, I know your engine, I've actually worked on games your company's released just through an intermediary. Might be an easier kind of springboard into that kind of stuff. But it's like I say, especially if depends on the kind of games you're willing or interested in working on. And in the same time, these waves change massively as to temporarily, I'm guessing, there's lots of money flush into VR. Some of it's kind of considered dumb money, meaning from outside, they're not game experts who are spending investment money in this space, but they want their technology to take advantage of this new platform, and so they're willing to pay someone who can use Unity. And if you can find a way to adapt your skills to where that money is right now, that might help fuel or funnel you into some other opportunity, or might get you enough earnings to savings to do your other stuff or whatever. But it's a lot of it's keeping the ear to the ground because those things change very rapidly. Some years ago it was free to play stuff. Some years ago it was web casual stuff. But these waves kind of rise and fall. But yeah, so it super varies on what the company's opportunities. Some of them are super exclusive or hard. The other thing I'll say too is that on those job requirements, while obviously you need most of them, I will often say that those job requirements are sometimes a little bit optimistic on what they expect to get for the price that they're offering to pay. And that part of that is the process of the interview and the negotiation. As long as you're upfront about hey, I would be learning this piece of it, but I've got the rest of what you're looking for. Or you know what, I put in these times, this amount of time learning and practicing this stuff. This would be my first time doing X, Y, or Z though, is part, it may still be worth applying to some of those. Those aren't necessarily as cut or dry as they might look. Depending on, say also in the company. Some might just turn around and be don't be silly. But no harm in having asked or whatever.
I saw on when you were talking about your previous projects, you had a lot of prototypes. What was your standard size on the prototypes? Were they just mechanic testing, or were they level?
Oh yes. So those things were. So that was a weird era of my life. And in particular, what I was trying to explore, it was part of this dialogue at the time, and some of it still stuck around. Some indies who were kind of from my generation. And it was this idea of well, okay, there's certain things that we can communicate through poetry or through writing or through film or through music, but we feel like we haven't really found what it is we can do with gameplay to communicate ideas or to explain, introduce concepts, because we've kind of in the commercial industry sphere been very stuck to oh, you're shooting zombies with a shotgun again, or X, Y, or Z, you're matching 3 puzzle pieces again, but this time they're a different kind of object. And so a lot of it was tiny little mechanical prototypes. These are things I slammed together in 5 to 10 hours, the hackiest code imaginable. They're all playable and all digital, with the exception of 1 or 2 for weird artsy reasons, or only semi-interactive, or click-through menus or whatever. A lot of it is total garbage. A lot of it's just sort of a pure graveyard. The other thing I believed in at the time, though, was this idea of at some point one of my books called photographer's algorithm of a photographer, especially now with digital cameras, they'll take just 300 shots. Because any given one of them might have been slightly more in focus, or got the right combination of people not blinking, or got just a little bit better light. and that it's easier to just like mash out a ton of stuff and then look back on it and then pick out some stuff that like, well, this one really worked. And so that's where my first iPhone games came from, or at least my self-published ones, was a lot of those mashed out prototypes. And that wasn't even why I went into it, but that was what I sort of looked back on and did, was like, okay, well, this one got traffic. This one I liked. This one I think has potential. This one, this creative artist who I like says he thinks that there's something really there, even if no one else seems to see it. So I took each one of those things and like put some more polished time on, give it a few months or a few weeks, depending on the case, something I could then release as like a non-prototype level kind of thing. But it was very, very tiny, disastrous stuff. Most of those are actually, they're all in Flash. There's a summary video of that at interactionartist.com. They're not currently playable. The PHP stuff that I wrote to navigate those, unfortunately, is one of these things that like security changes and how servers work stopped being secure, so I had to take down the PHP page to access those. But there's a summary video that kind of goes through like the groups of learning, so you can kind of see them being played. But a lot of it's some weird stuff.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Writer.
Okay, gotcha. Well, so one of the things that I've tended to find very helpful is that because of improvements in the technology available to us and the tutorials available to us, I think it's very, very useful, even if someone predominantly wants to position themselves as a designer, as an artist, as a writer, as a whatever other kind of role it might be, to be able to at least mash together a gameplay prototype. And it could be like really rusty, crummy, imperfect, shoddily coded, don't ship it, don't sell that, whatever. But to be able to stand up your ideas in a situated context, to be able to show to somebody else, a lot of the value that some of our technical designers had internally, even on bigger teams, was there was somebody else who, if they're left alone for a day, which that alone was kind of sometimes a miracle around meetings, was they could like stand something up so it worked well enough to put in front of a producer and be like, spend more time on it, or like, no. And if you work in a very, very specialized kind of category of field, you often wind up, if you can't make your own gameplay prototype stuff, having to kind of go around and like tug on like, hey, will you help me? Will you help me do this thing? I just have this, it's not even that complicated. I just need someone to help me do this thing. And to be able to get yourself out of that so you can try out your own ideas, make them work in a way you can put on the web or put in front of strangers, helps you work out a lot of the kinks a lot faster internally without having to have that bottleneck of going through somebody else. And like I say, especially with modern platforms and technology, it doesn't require the same deep level of specialized knowledge that it used to just make a kind of working thing. And for some people too, this also takes a form of like, maybe they use GameMaker or Stencil or Construct or whatever as a rapid prototyping platform to just spit out a thing and be like, all right, look at this team. Now we're on the same page. It's much easier to get them to buy into that if it's already interactable than if it's like just a concept to try to get them to think about.
So do you think students should work on making games that are kind of more attuned to the market? As in, like, they're looking at people and, like, what's really trendy out there and they're trying to do that? Or do you think they should really kind of explore what's really out there in terms of all these types of games that they can make?
I mean, I think again, this is one of the things that I think super duper depends on the person and what their risk tolerance is, what they want to achieve in life, what audiences they're trying to win the approval of. There are certainly plenty of people that I know who they were far more concerned about what is the like artistic community of curators, of art community, of professors or whatever care about their game, the kind of things that might do well in festivals, which is not the same audience of people who like will just sell a bunch of copies to like people who just want something to do on the bus. But there's nothing wrong with either one of those. It's a completely legitimate, completely valid thing to do. And the other thing I'll make about that point too is that for people who are targeting the like, you know what, I want to make kind of researchy games, or I want to make kind of very educational games or whatever, there are often completely different indirect ways to fund that besides, can I sell this to a consumer? There are grants for that stuff if you learn how to write them and get the right connections. There are internal research academic communities that like all they do is they pay people to like make these things and explore these problems. Or there are literal kind of like commissioned artworks where if you make the right case to the right kind of outside source of like, hey, here's the thing I think is worth making, help make it happen as my Patreon or whatever. And those are things, right? And this is likewise, especially now because of the crowdfunding scene, there is different answers as the kind of things that get crowdfunded or the kind of things that get paid in open beta. So it's everyone's going to find their way into different niches. They're all going to dovetail and coexist. But I think it really comes down to what kind of games or what kind of channel you're most comfortable in, what kind of ideas you most interested have. And also, like, if you're applying to work in a commercial company and you're looking career track, studio track, showing some competency or comfort with the idea that, like, this is a consumer product I'm building and I have an engineer or kind of a service mentality towards, like, how do I adapt this to meet my customers' needs, might fare better than the, like, I have a vision and I'm going to be a sort of, like, put up a fight to make sure we realize my personal thing, which, again, like, might actually be good if you're going solo indie and you have to kind of be that lead vocalist in front of a crowd. less so if you're trying to like, hey, you know what, I'm here to serve the vision of my bosses and show them I know how to do that.
Chris, if they want to get in contact with you after this, what's the best way to do that?
So easiest way is, and I will semi also pitch this as a mailing list thing. Something I've started doing because I had like 2 or 3 hours a week when I wasn't helping people, and so I wanted to. If you go to gamketo.training, and again, there's no E in it, or you can just go to gamketo.com and it's a link off there. I have a weekly list of people who I send out like a little email to, but it literally is like, hey, what have you been doing? What are you doing next? And everyone who writes back, I read it and I respond to it, and it allows me to sort of like offer some really quick course correction or just like a high five of like, yeah, you're awesome, keep doing that. But it's a way that it helps me understand someone's context. So when they do have a question by email, I know something about what they've been doing, what they were trying to do. Because otherwise, what used to happen was I would just get a question out of the blue from somebody and be like, I can't invest the amount of time it would take right now to figure out which thing is. Like my time's fully accounted for at the moment between my other stuff. So that is probably the easiest way to make sure that I know someone's situation. So when you do contact me by email, I can actually like have some sort of helpful advice because I'll know your thing. But that is the easiest answer right now. Oh, or also on Twitter is probably even easier, at Gamketo. Every single day I tweet several times from there. Easy way to reach me.
All right. Well, Chris, thanks a lot for speaking with us. We really appreciate it.